Welcome back. The topic for panel 5 is ethics in the compound security environment. Moderating this panel is Dr. Mark Grzegorzewski from JSOU. Providing their perspectives are a distinguished panel of experts, including Dr. Deane Baker from the University of New South Wales, Canberra, Dr. Shannon French from Case Western Reserve University, and Dr. Heather Roff from the University of Colorado. Dr. Grzegorzewski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave. As Dave Oakley mentioned, with this panel is titled Ethics in the Compound Security Dilemma, and today we're going to be forecasting the ethical challenges SOF practitioners might face in the compound environment. Joining me today, we have two people currently, with a third person going to be joining us here in just a moment, hopefully. First, we have Dr. Shannon French, and then Dr. Heather Roff. Dr. Shannon French is the Inamori Professor in Ethics at Case Western Reserve University, or CWRU, where she teaches for the Department of Philosophy in the School of Law and the CGSC Foundation's General Hugh Shelton Distinguished Chair of Ethics. Prior to coming to CWRU in 2008, she taught military ethics for 11 years at the U.S. Naval Academy in the Division of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. At CWRU, she's the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. Her primary field is military ethics. We also have Dr. Heather Roff. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2010. She's currently a research scientist at DeepMind, one of the leading artificial intelligence companies in the world, as well as an associate professor at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, and a Future of War Fellow with New America in Washington, D.C. Her research interests include the law, policy, and ethics of emerging technologies such as autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, robotics, and cyber, as well as in international security and human rights protection. Ladies, thank you so much for joining me this morning. While we wait for...
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And again, hopefully Deane will be able to join us here in just a moment. What I'd like to first start off by doing is just offering you ladies a few minutes to give top of mind comments on this topic here before us today. So first, let's turn it over to Shannon, and then we'll go to Heather.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's nice to be here, although I think for everyone, this is an uncomfortable time and a difficult anniversary coming up. So we're all aware of that context in which we're having this meeting. I would like to just make a general point that we're going to be talking a lot in this panel about things like new technologies and new tools that people can use in military contexts. But even as we do that, I think it's always important to keep in mind that no new tool is going to take away the fundamental complexity and sheer messiness of the kind of military ethics issues that we have to wrestle with. As a new technology emerges, it's always our task to try to figure out how to apply the principles that are time tested to that technology. But what doesn't change is human nature, and what doesn't change is the moral weight of what we do. So I always like to point that out and essentially remind people that you really can't, to use a word I've heard recently, algorithmatize ethics.
Very good. Heather, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I just also want to clarify, I'm no longer at DeepMind. So I'm a fellow at Brookings and the University of Cambridge. So some of my top level remarks, I think, to get us going are really thinking about the different types of technologies that are likely to be used by SOF forces going forward, and how those technologies, be they autonomous systems or artificial intelligence, aids, decision aids, applications, things like this, will in some senses shape and shift the way we perceive an adversary, the way we perceive ourselves. But to Shannon's point, that does not change the fact that we are moral agents, and we carry the moral responsibility for our actions. So how we design and deploy and use technologies is there's ethics built into all of this, right? So we have to consider ethical principles or concerns at the very beginning of searching for a new technology, for a new capability to advance our warfighting capacities. And so when you realize that ethics has to be a first discussion where you're considering all the things at design phase, by the time you get to deployment phase, things should be much easier on that tail to make sure that you are upholding the laws of war, that you're upholding moral principles, things like this. So I would just say from the get-go, ethics is not a bolt-on, it's not an afterthought, it's not something that we need to do from our armchair philosophizing. It is in fact practical action guiding principles that are intended to guide our decisions, not just on the battlefield, but even in the lab. So thank you.
Thank you. And we're definitely going to dig into, how you cannot algorithmatize ethics and, building in ethics on the front end and having that as a first consideration as opposed to trying to bolt it on the back side. So a question that I'd like to throw to both of you ladies, and we'll start with Shannon and then go to Heather. Should we continue to compare AI to human thinking, or is it better for us to categorize it as something different? Heather? I'm sorry, Shannon?
First, I think what I would say on that is that it isn't good for us to too often think of artificial intelligence and so forth as being just another version of human intelligence. And there's several reasons for that. One of the main points that I would make is that the way that we train machines and the way that we code them is not really that closely akin to anything like what we as humans do when we're, for example, learning the world and learning to speak and learning categories and kinds. So an example that I've heard used that I found helpful is that if you have, for example, a child that you're trying to teach a new word to, the human mind can grasp some kind of category to a very flexible extent. So you can show them pictures like in a child's picture book of an animal like a turtle, and then you can go the way you and people have even done that intentionally to see how it works. There was a study where they tried to show how a system asked to distinguish between huskies, the dog, and wolves ended up focusing on whether or not there was snow in the background of the picture versus grass to determine which was which. So all of that is to say that it is, I think, worrisome if we, for one thing, if we start to think of these systems as anything close to infallible or being better at these kind of classifications necessarily than we are. And I think it's also not a great idea to think of them as just doing what we do, maybe faster and better, some kind of superhuman. Because I think if we do that, we will fall prey to automation bias and won't be looking for the ways we can improve how these systems actually assess and classify. And of course, the stakes are going to be very high if you're talking about classifications that might lead to targeting.
All very good points. Very good points. We're going to circle back to a few of those. Heather.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fundamental mistake to analogize artificial intelligence with human intelligence, or that these are just another way of humans doing a particular task or mission set. To Shannon's point, we humans understand concepts. We have a very interesting way of building these abstract notions of things, big ideas. That's why we're very flexible in general in the way in which we can apply them. AIs don't understand concepts. They can't. They fundamentally do not have that type of computational power, or they don't have. We haven't made some major breakthrough for them to understand concepts. They don't understand what a dog is, let alone what a husky is versus a wolf. So the very idea, if I say the word dog, somebody in the audience will think of a dog in their head. They'll come up with some vision of a dog in their head. That's not how these systems work. Moreover, when we're talking about artificial intelligence as thinking, I think the language that we use will affect our expectations of the behavior of those systems. And so when they fail, and they will fail in very weird ways that we would not anticipate as humans, because we would never do something like that. It can be quite dangerous depending upon the type of system and the type of environment. And so when we're talking about deploying these systems in complex environments with lots of noise, lots of changing, lots of adaptation, lots of complexity, it is incredibly difficult to even get them to behave in the way we want them to behave. And then to do any sort of assurance on those systems through testing, verification, validation, things like that. So we are kind of in the nascent stages of even getting those things to be tested and verified and validated, let alone kind of liking it to a human's mind. And the objection I hear all the time is like, well, I can't look inside another person's head, so therefore I don't need to understand what's happening with the system. And that's, again, not necessarily true. Cognitively, we do have at least a little bit of a handle on a theory of mind of people. I have experience, with training in a unit, and I know the background of all these people, and I have a theory of mind of another. And so in that respect, we do have quite a bit of understanding around human to human intelligence. But when we're talking about humans trying to understand machine intelligence, we don't have a theory of mind of machines. We don't understand how they work, why they were doing the things that they're doing. Yes, we can look inside of a neural network and see which parameters or hyperparameters are being weighted, but the complexity of the system itself is we just don't have a good understanding. And it's just all math. It's just really, really complex math that is looking for probabilities of correlations between things. And so once you start to realize that it can pick up on trees versus snow and not really dogs, getting your mind around the fact that it's a perception machine. So there's perception, there's reasoning, but there's a great deal of uncertainty even in those calculations. And so the more exquisite the system, the greater the uncertainty, and it compounds. So we have kind of an aggregated uncertainty thing happening here. And you have systems, if they're physical systems moving around in the world, any sort of small changes, like I deploy a system in the jungle versus I then deploy the same system in a desert, you're going to have very different outcomes just based on the complexity and the change of the environment. And so while a human can go, I know exactly what I have to do, whether or not I'm in a jungle or I'm in a desert, the systems that we're building right now are so dumb that they don't, and they're really, really pretty bad. And so I think lowering the expectations and using things like the words classify or predict or probabilistic or things like that, rather than saying it's like human intelligence, I'm just replacing the human. That's not it at all. I wouldn't, these systems are idiot savants. They can do one thing and in one thing somewhat well over and over. And if we're using these systems at scale and we're using them in these high stakes situations, we have to think very carefully about the risk assessments, about the testing, and about then our moral responsibility to deploy them, to take account for their actions, because these machines are not going to be held accountable. They are just tools. So we have to think, I think, from an ethics perspective, very, very carefully and clearly about when to use, how to build, and when to deploy, because these systems are not going to be like a PFC, sitting down the road that I can fairly guarantee that I know is what he or she is going to do. Over.
Mark, if I could just jump in, I First of all,
Absolutely.
you probably saw me nodding along
Yes.
with with Heather. Wonderful explanation of how this works, and I also was jotting down "idiot savant." I love that description. That's terrific. I also just wanted to throw out one other additional point that just follows directly on everything we just learned from Heather, and that is that when people are selling AI, so the hype that comes with people selling AI, one of the things that is often done is they will use percentages to try to make their system sound tremendous and better than humans. So they'll say, our error rate is only this, and humans make this percentage of errors, so you should use the AI. And this is done in many different contexts, business to military, of course. But the trouble and the way you can respond to that is you need to ask, what kind of errors does it make? Not just percentages. Percentages can be tremendously misleading. It's kind of a hackneyed example by now, but I still enjoy it. There was a intentional adversarial attack on Google AI done by some MIT researchers, where they showed that they could fool the Google AI system into mistaking a tabby cat for a bowl of guacamole. Now, they were doing this on purpose, and it wasn't in the ordinary way of business. But the point that is made there is exactly to what we were just hearing from Dr. Roff. The kind of mistake you have there would not be made by any human. I could show you that picture of the cat over and over again, and there is no universe in which you would confuse it with guacamole. So I think it's really significant that we make that kind of questioning more routine. That if someone says, oh, you should use this because it will make fewer errors than humans, you want to say, okay, but what kinds of errors? And just further to that point, just a personal example that I found very funny myself. My child was in a summer camp, and pretty horrifyingly, actually, they had a facial recognition system in place to send the parents automatically photos that were taken that had your kid in them. There's so many problems with that. I don't even want to want to start. But the point I wanted to make that relates to this is that I was curious about how well this system worked. And so I took a batch of the photos and quickly looked through them. The machine found 5 pictures that it said had my child in it. Of those 5, 3 of them were in fact my kid, but the other 2, one was a child that, again, no normal person would ever confuse with mine. There were no similarities at all that I could detect. And the other one was of trees. So again, not even close. But also significantly, in the whole batch, I found 61 pictures of my own child. And I do think this is also relevant here because we don't want to lose this element of the human in some of these very important decision-making processes. The other thing is, and this is quite true, I noticed in those 61 photos some aspects of the way they were responding, some of the facial expressions, and immediately became concerned that they were unwell, called the camp, and was told they were about to call me to have me come because, in fact, yes, I was right. They were unwell. So all of which is to say, these systems are hyped to the moon these days, but they cannot do all of what the people selling them say they can do.
Yes. Great and horrifying example at the same time. And I think that where this really becomes problematic is when you have, and I'll call it what it is, snake oil salesmen pushing AI technologies that cannot deliver, near what they say they can. And then you have humans using that technology, unquestioning, if what data was put into the systems, how the outcomes were derived, and just blindly following what the machine tells them to do. And of course, with facial recognition, we see people getting swept up who are completely innocent. We see precog-like AI technologies predicting where crime will occur and harassing people. We really need to start asking important questions on the front end before we even buy this AI tech, and then ask the questions even after we buy it about how it's employed, and what the error rate is, and as you said, what kind of errors can come about through the AI tech. So I'd like to move on to another question now, and then after you answer this, I'm going to pair it with a question from the audience. And so I'll pose this question first to the two of you. Why is it important that we consider the ethics today of the technologies of tomorrow? And we'll start with Heather and then move to Shannon.
Sure. Well, I think there's a few practical considerations, right? So, I can give you the metaphysical argument that, ethics is everywhere all the time, and so you have to consider it all the time. But I think that from a military standpoint, there's just practical considerations about how we design and develop and build and buy systems. And so when you realize that, a lot of the systems that are in development right now, either for demo purposes or for, kind of the high side, getting a special piece of kit to soft forces, but not, to like the big Navy or big Air Force or things like that. That still takes a really long time, even when you're kind of doing these spirals and sprints and trying to get new tech demoed and up and out. And so, the technologies of tomorrow, I think of it as like, yes, the technologies of tomorrow are being developed today. They won't be deployed to the forces today. It will take 5-10 years to get through an acquisitions program and get that kit to the people who need it. And so, we have to start asking these questions today, so I am the primary author, special governmental expert that wrote the AI ethics principles for the Department of Defense's AI principles. And so, we wrote, that was for the Defense Innovation Board, and the secretary signed those into effect in February of 2020. And so those 5 principles apply DoD wide, right? So there's, responsible, is it auditable, right? Is it traceable? Is it governable? Is it equitable, right? We have all of these principles that are there to act as kind of guides in the design and development of technologies now. Everything from something that's just a demo all the way into major acquisitions programs and major software acquisitions programs. And so if that's the case, then we do have to, on the traceable, at least if nothing, on the principle of being traceable, you have to know, what is the data that I used? Why did I choose that data? Is there bad data in there? What happens, what does on-label use look like? What does off-label use look like? What are the series of outputs that I'm going to be able to somehow audit back to something, right? What happens when there are software updates or upgrades? How do I ensure that the testing and verification of that system hasn't fundamentally shifted in its distribution? And so, just even thinking about that requires us to ask all these questions today and to set into motion the types of institutional as well as organizational changes to ensure that that behavior and that questioning, that ethics is not a dirty word, that happens, from now through the future, because the DoD does need quite a bit of institutional. You need a lot of force to get that institution to shift in meaningful ways. It's kind of like the Titanic, if you wait too long, you can't turn the big boat. And so, what we have to do now is really start thinking about enculturating the kinds of self-reflection and questioning about, well, is this system going to be designed to enhance my moral responsibility and agency? Or am I designing it mindlessly, almost somatically, and then I'm surprised when it's not doing the thing that I want, or it's inducing a different set of incentives for human behavior? And so then I have to work backwards to that incentive structure in human behavior. So I think the ethics questions now about what does training look like? What does the testing regime look like? What does human machine teaming require, right? There's all sorts of these different questions that we have to start asking now and putting the structures in place now, so that when that system is actually through acquisitions and in the hands of warfighters, we are not going, oh my God, I never foresaw this. No, we have to be a little bit more preventive and not so reactive. Over.
Great. And I saw a lot of head nodding from Shannon, so I'm sure she's going to head on to this. Shannon?
Well, yes. Yeah, panel, you didn't get it because I'm once again in violent agreement. But I, having said that, I think I will rather go in a slightly different direction, just because I completely agree with all of the points that were just made by Heather. So just another different point that I would make is simply to acknowledge that in the application of these technologies to military settings, you're also dealing with the principles of the just war tradition. And those two are not really subject to the whims of new technologies or different changes, because they're based on literally millennia of people recognizing what you have to do in order to limit the already horrific scope of war. So what I have in mind here is things like the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality. Those haven't wavered, and it's essential to keep them at the core of not just international law, but of the actual understanding of those doing the fighting. So when you talk about the principle of distinction, you're talking about determining who you can kill. It's as blunt as that. You're asking, in this context of already being in a violent struggle, whom is it appropriate to target, and who are you supposed to avoid and do your absolute best to even keep safe, actually a positive duty to keep them safe. And so when we're building new technology, we have to make sure that, to again echo what Heather was saying, it has to be from the beginning of the design process that these principles are understood, and nothing that's created will actively undermine the attempt to uphold these principles. So, for example, you wouldn't want a system that leaps too quickly to identify someone as an appropriate target on insufficient evidence. Obviously, humans can make that kind of error too, but you definitely don't want to add another reason for that error to occur. It's hard enough. It's already such a difficult determination that you don't want the system to make it worse. And with proportionality as well, you don't want a system that plays the role of another authority, perhaps urging a certain level of response that may not be intuitively correct or right for the people involved. I mean, I'll never forget that one of the folks that I had the chance to work with at the Naval Academy, Bob Proano, used to tell me about when he was a pilot in Afghanistan earlier in Operation Enduring Freedom, that the best commander he ever had used to end every mission briefing by saying, "Unless it doesn't look right." And initially that annoyed him because he was like, "Oh, come on, just tell us what to do and don't throw that in there." But he came to see that as incredibly important, because it was saying, look, you're there. You're in the moment. You're seeing what you see right there. You're maybe getting additional information moment by moment from forces on the ground. You need to be able to respond to that, and I need to be able to trust you to do that. And all of that is important to that agency and autonomy that we've been talking about, and that the moral lives that we live and what we have to carry after the choices are made. So what we don't want is any system that interferes with that. And I think related to that, when we look at tragedies outside of the military context, like the crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, one of the things that I think people rightly found properly horrifying about that was that there were the pilots were unable to seize back manual control when they most needed it. So the kind of design that allows the human to continue to bear the moral weight of these kind of decisions that we've unfortunately had to face and wrestle with for so many years is essential, whilst hopefully designing something that might help with them. I mean, I do still have a whiff of technological optimism in me, where I hope that we could make systems that might nudge us towards making good decisions in those contexts. But that has to be very intentionally designed.
Great response. And I like the story there about, take a minute, take a second, pause. If it doesn't look right, maybe take another course of action. Of course, that slows down the response time, but maybe it allows you to make a better decision. A little bit slower decision, but a better decision in the long run. And of course, you cannot do that when you take a human out of the loop, as you mentioned with the aircraft, which is troubling. Something might not look right, and there's just nothing you can do about it. So we've had, as I anticipated, some questions rolling in here, and I'd like to pose one of them to you from the audience. And it's kind of a counter argument to what we just discussed. And the question was, are there any disadvantages that come along with ethical limitations to AI? And we'll go back to Heather and then to Shannon. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that gets popped around again and again, right? So, you kind of hear this like, well, if I'm going to constrain myself and tie my hand behind my back, my adversary is not going to do that. And so therefore, I shouldn't be ethical because my adversary is not going to be ethical, right? And you go, well, one, if that's the kind of formal argument of like, well, then everything's on the table, right? Everything. There's no laws, there's no norms, there's no morals. Everything is on the table, right? It's frankly it's the strongest realist argument, right? If you want to go down that road, I think it's a very dangerous road to travel, because one of the things is that every single organization within the DoD has a set of values, right? And we as American citizens have a set of values, constitutionalism and individualism and particular political and civil rights and social rights. And then you would say things like, and within my organization, I want to trust my compatriot, right? I want to have them, this is kind of the Pauline principle, do unto others kind of thing, right? And so if you take the argument that my adversary is not going to play by the ethics that I'm going to play by, and you scale that, then you shouldn't be playing by ethics in any part of your life, which I think is pretty weird. And then you shouldn't be surprised if war becomes completely horrific, right? This is when we get into these kind of total war discussions, where you're targeting civilians and you're targeting, you're committing perfidious acts and you're attacking, the Red Cross, and you're doing so to minimize that, right? To say, look, we have to use force, but we do it within this prescribed set of boundaries. Now, some of those boundaries, as Shannon had discussed, proportionality and distinction, distinction's a pretty hard and fast rule. But there are some interesting things, right? Well, am I using civilian infrastructure to move material or something, right? So there's little edge cases where you can kind of start once you pick up arms, so to speak, or start participating in hostilities in various ways. Proportionality is also, it's proportionate to the military objective sought, right? So the amount of force is only proportionate to the military objective, which by legal standards within the United States, as well as internationally, that military objective has to be determined by a human. And so, when we're starting to peel apart, where are the disadvantages of ethics? Well, ethics is already all around us. And if we say that we're going to be at a disadvantage if we try to build systems that are equitable and responsible and governable. That to me sends a really bad signal across the forces and across society to say, well, we're just not going to play ethically, screw them all, right? And that's something I don't think we want to do. And as a professional military, we don't want to send that signal to our professional men and women doing this, because they too have an honor code that they're living by. And to say that they don't need to have that anymore, all bets are off, I think would send very, very dangerous precedents, and it would enculturating a very different kind of military force that I don't think is in concert with the United States and its values.
Sure. No, it reminds me of a discussion I had last night with my class over at National Intelligence University, and somebody brought up, why do we have to fight by the rules when the enemy does not? And I said to them, well, but by definition, the enemy not fighting by the rules makes them the bad guy in the situation, and us following the rules makes us the good guy. So it gives us the moral high ground to fight with the rules, even though we have to jump through some extra hoops. And it's a little bit more difficult for us, but eventually we find our way there. So Shannon, thoughts?
Well, I'll just follow on that very point, that I think sometimes what does get lost when people are making the suggestion that we fight without rules is that those who get harmed by that are absolutely going to include our own troops. And by that, I'm talking about grave harms that may not be physical, but in some ways are worse. So I'm talking about things like moral injury and various forms of psychological trauma, because it's simply not the case that you can completely turn off everything else you've learned in your life and everything else you've been taught. It's difficult enough to overcome the basic taboo against killing in order to do your job when you're in that setting. But to also be told that there are no rules at all and you can kill whomever you want and, kill them all, let God sort them out, isn't helping you. It's actually stripping you of the one thing that gives you an anchor back to that identity that you chose, that you wanted to be, to use your phrase, you wanted to be the good guy, but you wanted to be part of something meaningful. You wanted to be part of something worthwhile, and only that is worth dying for or suffering the loss of your closest friends for. It isn't, in fact, a victory if everyone who returns is unrecognizable even to themselves. If they've thrown everything away that they originally valued, what kind of a win is that? And I think I would emphasize this, and those of you who are familiar with my my work and the Code of the Warrior and so forth, I talk about this a lot, that this is not a new idea. This goes all the way back through everything we know of people who have fought throughout the centuries, that what is necessary to help you survive all of that is to have a consistent, chosen set of lines you won't cross, and you won't cross them no matter what. And it's actually really powerful that those aren't set by your enemy. You don't hand that to your enemy. You don't say, hey, you set the bar and I'll just, jump where you tell me to. The point is you set it for yourself, and you say, no matter what, I'm not going to do these things. Now, that won't be the exact same for every person. And when we're fighting certain kinds of opponents, it's certainly true that you have to make little adjustments around, how do we respond if they're going to use our rules against us? But that's nowhere close to throwing all the rules out. That's adjusting ROEs. That's not saying just kill them all. And it's still clinging on to this notion that is so vital, that you're not just a murderer. You're not just a sociopath. You're doing a job. You're part of a profession. And I think, as we look at that, and we look at what we're already asking people to do when we ask them to fight, they don't have the control or the power to choose which engagements they're going to be sent to. They get deployed and they have to go. So the only control we allow them, to think of it that way, is the control over how they act in the conflict. They don't get to choose the conflict, but how they act in it, they do. And so stripping them of that and just saying anything goes, I actually think that's a brutal thing and should never be done to our troops.
Great response, and this conversation is getting more questions from the audience. And so I'll pose this question to both of you ladies. Once again, starting with Heather, and the question goes: shouldn't constantly losing on the terms of moral high ground incentivize the revision of morals/ethics? Heather, what are your thoughts?
It's very Nietzschean. I would, if we're constantly, so the framing was that we're constantly losing based on our morals. And so we need to revise our morals, if that's what I'm hearing correctly. One, I'm a moral realist, so I don't think that we just can kind of revise morality when it's not convenient for our purposes. I'm a Kantian by training. I have a book on Kant. I don't think Immanuel Kant would be like, yeah, the categorical comparative, let's get rid of that one. So I don't think that, if, again, going back to something that Shannon said, right? Like, if you're losing, why are you losing? Is it really the morality that's not allowing you to win? I mean, when we think about wars, these are very complex endeavors, like take years, lots of different individuals, lots of different people. And I don't think morality is going to be the key here of whether you win or you lose. Now, morality is going to constrain your decision space, hopefully, and hopefully will end up protecting certain people and prohibiting certain impermissible acts. But the whole notion of winning a war, I mean, the United States hasn't really won a war in quite some time. We have this vision of everybody kind of, we are the white hat cowboys riding in to save the day. But in reality, if you look all the way back to the Korean War, right, we've had some tricky endeavors that we've had to wade through. And I don't know if it was because we weren't, coming out and winning in the way in which we perceived, because of our moral constraints. I think if anything, perhaps some of the decisions made that were not made through moral constraints might have ended up actually causing the discrediting, loss of reputation, having a people turn against you because of the types of force you're using against the civilian population, right? World public opinion, troop morale, the changeover of administration to administration, and their views on how war should be fought. Just look at Afghanistan, right? We've been doing this for 20 years and we've had quite a few different presidents in that time. So I think, I don't think we can just we want to say we're going to change our morals so that we're going to be more successful. If anything, we want to say, well, what's the criterion of success? And why is it that you think that morality is going to be the one, the monocausal variable, the one thing that is causing you to lose? I don't think that is in fact true. I mean, as an ethicist and a political scientist, I can tell you that like wars are messy and there's lots of different decisions. And also it's not just us, right? Adversaries come up and they go away and they have a choice too. And so there's a strategic interaction between, the different combatants. And so I would just be very skeptical of having that kind of argument.
Right. And I would just add to that, it can become a very slippery slope if you start to change, how you define one ethic. It can, affect other ethics as well, and not to mention the way that the ethics in war will impact the society.
Well, here's an example, right? When you look at just the American Constitution, if you go back to the Federalists, for instance, right, and you look at the debate that happened between Madison and Jefferson, and you had Jefferson wanting to have quite frequent constitutional conventions to rewrite the Constitution and have more, he was very had a lot of faith in that people would be pretty reasonable and savvy and participate in politics. And Madison was the exact opposite. He said, no, do not put faith that people will be reasonable and rational in politics, and do not mess with this Constitution that we just spent so long and quite beautifully created, to then have it ripped up and go, have a constitutional convention again and again and again. He said, no, you've got to let it sit. You got to because that will ingrain a set of values and a set of principles that this country needs to stay steady state, not all over the map all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Shannon, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm also going to start from the point that I don't accept the premise. I absolutely do not believe it's true that we have lost a war because we were too ethical. That would take a lot of convincing of me to sway me on that point. I don't see that. Where did we lose a war because we behaved too ethically? I do think that it's, again, important to distinguish between, as again, the just war tradition does, between two different, let's call them just parts of the ethics of war. One is the decision to go to war, and the other is how you conduct yourself in war. And as I was saying earlier, the second part, how you conduct yourself in war, is the only part that the actual troops get to control, because they are the ones executing these missions and making these decisions in the moment, and that can be interfered with too. But at least in principle, that ought to be more within their control. They don't select which conflicts to get involved in, and the reason that matters is when you're talking about things that we have lost or failed to achieve a definitive victory in throughout recent history, you could argue that you have to go back to the way in which we started those conflicts, why we engaged with them, and whether the original points were ever met. Just war theory has all these basically barriers that are supposed to get in the way. They often sadly don't, but they're supposed to get in the way of taking a nation to war. And there are things like you have to wait until the last resort, exhausting all other options and all, for example, attempts to negotiate and so forth, all diplomatic options. And you also have to have a just cause, and you have to have legitimate authority, and you have to, conduct various attempts to determine whether or not your own intentions are clear, which includes something that came up a lot in our more recent conflicts, whether or not you go in with an exit strategy and so forth. So all of those pieces are policy pieces that happen at the level of government. And if those are not handled correctly, then you might very well not get to a victory. But that has nothing to do with the ethical or unethical conduct of the war itself. And again, furthermore, just to emphasize the point I raised earlier, what if we won? If we win by throwing absolutely everything we supposedly care about out the window, I'm not convinced that that's at all an appealing solution. And I also feel like that's to me, I find that really depressing if anyone actually believes that we can't win without completely sacrificing who we are. I don't think that's true. And I think if you believe that, then you don't really believe in our values. You don't really think that they are values that can succeed. And that's deeply troubling. So no, I don't think we should throw out our values in order to win. But I also think we can win conflicts with our values intact.
Sure. Yeah, you have to question, is it truly a win if you had to throw all your values out and it completely changed who you are in the long run? Again, is that worth it? And again, the questions just keep coming on this topic. So we'll take one more and then we'll pivot off to a different topic. This most recent question comes, it says, Doesn't the socio-political context for the US and its justification for the war determine its morality? Killing 1 or 1,000 doesn't cause moral injury. It is caused by ill-defined purpose and constraint on the use of violence. Shannon, we'll stick with you, and then we'll go to Heather, and then we'll move on to another topic.
One of the best writers, I think, on moral injury is Jonathan Shea, who many people are familiar with for his excellent works on this topic, books like Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. He worked for years with veterans, particularly originally with Vietnam veterans, but also more recently with those of recent conflicts, to try to understand and really get down to the core of what causes moral injury. And in the end, what he concludes is very much this notion that it comes from a kind of betrayal. And that betrayal is absolutely going to connect back to whether the people who sent you had a clear idea of what you were doing and why, and how it might work. And again, like exit strategy and all that is part of that. And if you are sent with a clear and unambiguous goal and mission, and you have to take lives, that in itself does not necessarily cause moral injury. That's quite correct. Your questioner is right about that. But where it crosses over into moral injury is where you're either asked to do things that betray your values, you see others in authority doing that, or, you know, just generally you see those lines I talked about earlier being crossed, and you have to try to reconcile the losses that you're experiencing with the sense that what's been damaged is, again, more than the physical, that you've lost, that you and your friends have somehow been asked to throw your identities away and your values away. So that's I think I would tend to agree with the spirit of the question there, that they're on the right track.
Thank you. Heather.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Shannon just said. So again, we're not going to be too adversarial here. I would just add, you know, Hannah Arendt has this really great phrase in her book on the human condition, and she says that, you know, it's about a discussion between me and myself, right? Like it's the 2-in-1 is what she calls it. That is that I have a conscience, and I have to live with myself after I do things. And so, you know, I can, those types of actions where I can't live with myself are the types of things that I think Shannon's alluded to around moral injury. Now, I definitely see the betrayal aspect of that, but there's also yes, when we're talking about war and we're talking about armed conflict, it's always a socio-political thing, right? War is itself, right? Clausewitz, the continuation of, you know, politics by other means, right? So if we know then that there are certain things that I cannot control, and I as a volunteer in armed services, I'm going to go wherever they're telling me I have to go, right? That's the kind of you sign away, right? That's the decision you sign away. And so, but within that, hopefully there are opportunities for greater constraints so that you can continue to have that moral wholeness, right? That you don't have to be put into positions where those types of activities, actions, mission sets, something like this would cause that moral injury. So I think, again, depending upon, I see there's a comment from the audience, right, that there's, you know, firebombing of Dresden or nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, napalm, things like this, right? I think, again, one of the, to not be too political about it, it's like looking at what the circumstances ruling at the time. This is how we determine command responsibility, right? What did somebody know, the circumstances ruling at the time, and then what were the available means and methods with which I can fight. I'm not going to comment on particular types of weapon systems or use of weapons in war. But I would also say, like, just go back to the history too and see what the response was from the public at the time, what the response was from the leadership at the time and see if there was any pushback. And if there's not pushback, then we can make some moral arguments about their use. But I think we have to be careful about rewriting history a little bit. So,
great point. Great point. So I now have one question for Shannon and then one for Heather. My question to Shannon is, what concerns do you have about the push to move quickly to deploy AI systems in the military? And then my question for Heather after that is, how do we get rid of AI bias? Shannon?
Well, I think I hinted at some of my answer before when I was talking about AI hype, but in this particular context, I want to expand on that and highlight the fact that unfortunately, the US military does not have the best record with careful deployment of new technology. And what I mean by that is there are many examples of things that got rushed to troops before they were properly tested, or where they were actually tested with fake tests and so forth. Famously, the Bradley fighting vehicle is an example of that, but there's been others through the years. We've sent troops with rifles that explode in their faces. Unfortunately, this has happened. So it is absolutely rational to call out the powers that be on this and say, do better. That before you're going to rush a system to the troops, make sure that it, as I was mentioning earlier, doesn't make their job actually harder. And this can happen in a number of ways. You can have it be the case that the new technology adds to what we call the cognitive load, so that the individual becomes completely overwhelmed. So much information is being sent their way that it actually becomes harder and more stressful, which is hard to imagine, as it's already hard and stressful, but even worse to make decisions. Or again, if the systems themselves malfunction or fail just when they're needed most, or do not allow the human to retake manual control. So all of these are design decisions and testing factors that need to be dealt with early and often throughout the R&D process. And I think when we look at organizations like DARPA and the big companies that produce these things, it's important that they are always focused on the end user and not just listening to any of the hype that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Heather, what are your thoughts on getting rid of AI bias?
It's impossible.
Next
Next, the end. Look, we can't get rid of AI bias because everything is biased, right? Like, we are biased. The structures, the norms shape our behavior, right? Where we get the data from is going to shift in a certain way. We actually bias machines on purpose, right? So that they can more effectively do the task that we're assigning it, right? So I want to tune things a little bit so it pays attention, not to the trees, but to the sign, right? So I can do, we bias those things all the time. And we live in a biased environment. So I think even the attempt to mitigate bias, right? And we might say, well, we're not really mitigating bias, we're rebiasing in favor of something else, right? So if I say, I don't want algorithms to classify individuals based on race and sex and, all of these things that, clearly we don't want racist and sexist AI systems, right? But if I say I don't want racist and sexist AI systems, but the data that I've scraped shows that there is an underlying structure in the data that pulls towards racism or pulls towards sexism, then I have to rebias the data. I have to rebalance it in favor of not having those things. So it's a question of which value you're biasing for, but you're never going to get rid of bias.
Thank you. So with that in mind, I'd like to actually go into one of the audience questions that was posed earlier. And it's basically asking about your thoughts on explainable AI. The person wrote, the computer says no is hard enough to explain for a refused mortgage application. What do you do when the AI says to kill a human? So what are your thoughts on explainable AI? And we'll start with Shannon.
Well, I mean, I think the questioner is asking the right question in that when we're coming to the kinds of decisions that we've been talking about all along, like targeting decisions, it's particularly troubling if you have a black box, as we call it, situation where you really can't get at the heart of why this decision was made. Now, there are attempts, and this is where that little flash I had earlier of slight technological optimism comes out just a little bit. It's like, please work. But there are attempts being made to have systems that you can inquiry. And what they basically mean by that is that if you get if the machine, whatever the interface is, whether it's a handheld device or something, is telling you, hey, this is a good target, you can actually ask it based on what, and it can give you that back, and then you can assess that. The trouble is we're back to this balancing act. So on the one hand, if the machine is going to be if the system is going to be of any use at all, you don't want it to be burdensome, back to that cognitive load concern. But on the other hand, you want to be able to interact with it a little bit so that you're not just handing over your agency and your autonomy to this system. So it's quite tricky, and particularly if you are dealing with decisions that have to be made rapidly. As the point came up in the earlier conversation, I strongly agree that there are a lot of cases, more than we perhaps want to acknowledge, where delay is not a bad thing. We get stuck into the idea that acting first is always the right choice, and it isn't. The joke I often make, which is an old one, is sometimes it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. So we know what happened to the first mouse. So, acting first is not always best. But if you have a system that is something that you can inquiry and say, okay, what is this based on? And then use that to make your own judgment, but somehow quickly enough and not with so many factors that it overwhelms you. It's a tough balance. I would love to see if the people trying to build these systems could do that. And I think that's the gold ring or brass ring.
Yeah. I'm definitely going to have to recycle that mouse analogy about the second mouse getting the cheese. So I'll make sure to attribute that to you. Thank you. Heather, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so there's a couple of different movements within the AI community, right? So the Explainable AI, the XAI folks coming out of DARPA initially, that movement, the initial movement by the guy Dave, who the program manager over at DARPA who started this, he wasn't looking at explainability for end users. He wanted technical explainability for engineers to be able to crack open that black box. Sorry if you hear a whine, my dog is deciding to become vocal. So he wanted to look at that from a technical perspective and be able to understand how the system is actually working when you have a deep neural net doing God only knows what within the different layers, right? And hidden layers. Later, we have kind of a movement around interpretable AI as well as explainable AI, right? And understanding AI and all of this stuff. And so that is much more heavily on the user side of it, right? Not necessarily on the technical specifics of how the system's operating that only a computer scientist with a PhD is going to understand, right? So the user side of the house is, I think, really important. And that's where you're getting into those user interfaces and the design choices therein. And so I think this is one mechanism by which you can get user uptake, right? If you, we call it like warfighter centric design, right? Like I need an operator who knows what the heck they're doing to come sit in with design teams so that designers can design the things that will help the operators. So here's a great example. For instance, there was one instance where there was a nice little AI widgety app that was going to be put onto an iPad and given to special forces. And so the designers come out and they give the soft guys the iPad, and they all looked at all the soft forces and went, "What am I going to do with this? I wear gloves. how am I supposed to do anything with this screen, right? And is it going to be ruggedized, or if I like throw it in my backpack, is it going to like the screen's going to crack and I get like one use out of it? Like, where is the operational utility here, right? And so things like that, those very simple, like I wear gloves. These very simple types of things need to happen, I think, at the very beginning, because then through explainable AI, yes, you can use explanation in a wide variety of ways. I tend to think of explanation as reason giving. So what's the machine going to do to give me reasons, right? Why it did X, Y, or Z. I can query down, like how Shannon had alluded to. I can do different types of data visualizations. You know, I can say, this is why it looks like this way. And then if I change it to a different data visualization, you know, maybe I'm looking at electromagnetic spectrum data, right? Maybe there's something that I'm looking at and I can revisualize it in multiple ways so that I can understand it better and I can understand what the system is doing. Or I can kind of drill down and say, well, why is it this? Or what was your uncertainty rate? What's the potential for error here? What are the sensor readings, right? You know, what is, you know, another system doing that I can cross-validate to make sure that it's, you know, you're getting kind of a dual authentication or dual phenomenology, right? So there's lots of different ways in which we can do it, but I do want to just make the distinction that there's XAI in the beginning, which is really a computer science, like I just want to understand the science behind how the system's acting, versus explainable AI for a user, because those are going to be very fundamentally different problem sets, and the solutions to them are going to be very, very different too.
Great distinction, great distinction. So again, I'm going to pivot slightly here and ask, how will machines affect human interactions? And we can again start with Shannon and then move to Heather. Shannon.
Well, I think, you know, we've already seen some of this because, you know, we all have our devices and our phones and so forth in our lives. And one of the things that we worry about is that, not to get super technical around this, but we have some better understanding. There's a lot more to learn about how the human brain itself works and how different networks take over at different times in the mind. And one thing that appears to be the case is that we have the part of our brain that is used when we are focusing very sharply on an analytic task is in opposition, almost like a toggle switch, with the part of our brain that is more social, that allows us to feel empathy and relate to another human being. And that it's very bad for us to get stuck in either of those modes, either stuck all the time in that social empathetic mode or stuck all the time in that analytic mode. There's some wonderful work on this by Dr. Anthony Jack and others. But the point I'm making is that with some of that background, you can say that we don't want systems that force us into one mode or another for too long, and that will have definite knock-on effects, including, we think, even some psychological disorders that can come from that. So if you're stuck all the time in some analytic mode, analyzing numbers on a machine, this will actually potentially throw you into depression and other psychological negative effects, because your brain is supposed to move back and forth between them. So I think how we interact with one another needs to, like everything else, have balance. Machines are just tools. And as long as we see them as that and put them in their place in that sense, they're fine. I'm glad that I could join you today virtually, because it wouldn't have worked otherwise. But at the same time, it's also nice to be able to still interact with people in person, and there are values to that. So I think as long as we look for that balance and make sure that we're not handing over too much of our lives to technical experiences and interfaces and so forth, we can hold on to our humanity.
Great response, Shannon. Thank you. Heather, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree as usual with Shannon, but I'm going to take a slightly different track on this and go at it from the science of human-machine teaming and human-machine interaction. And so, you know, one of the arguments, so I've been involved in the debates around autonomous weapon systems in the United Nations since 2014. You know, it's been going on for quite some time. And one of the one of the kind of knee-jerk reactions is like, well, we can't take humans out of the loop, which one DoD policy does not say that. We can, and we do, and we have different systems that we already use. But the knee-jerk reaction is like, well, don't worry, there's always going to be a human somewhere. So it's not fully autonomous, that there's going to be a human somewhere. And so as soon as you, sorry, the dog's barking now. As soon as you make that kind of assertion, you say, okay, well, don't worry about autonomous weapon systems. This is the French position, by the way. Don't worry, there's always going to be, right, a human somewhere. We'll never do the fully autonomous thing. You say, okay, well, once I grant that there's a human somewhere, well, now I have to have a lot more questions about what that interaction actually looks like. And I have to have a lot more data on how people interface with these systems and how I build those systems to ease that type of interaction. And when we talk about teaming, for instance, right, the science of teaming right now is really just about understanding human-human teams. We have very little evidence of how humans team with machines. We have evidence of how humans team with animals. We have evidence of how humans team with other people. But when it comes to, these kind of AI systems that are cognitive agents, that are cognitive assistants, and how they're pushing or pulling us in these different ways, we just don't have a lot of really good work here. And so I think going forward, when we're talking about, deploying these types of AI systems at scale for a wide variety of tasks, it doesn't have to be the pointy end of the stick, right? It can be, a lot of just data analytics. It can be a lot of information gathering. It can do a lot of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance work. But how we start to interact with those systems and how those systems are, to Shannon's point, affecting us needs a lot more scholarship, a lot more basic research. And so I would be very, very careful about going forward and saying, like, it's all going to be human machine teaming, and kind of avoiding the hype around human machine teaming. And then saying, like, maybe it's just human computer interaction. And then what does the interaction look like? And then do I have good cognitive assessments? And do I have good data? Do I have good thresholds? What about different people with different types of skill sets and assets? And all of these questions are kind of percolating up right now, and how we're going to do human systems integration engineering effectively when we just don't even understand what the teaming is going to look like at this point. So I would just say, like, kind of take a lot of that with a grain of salt and say, do we have the basic research already? If we don't, then take a bigger grain of salt with whatever is being promised.
Sure. So ladies, we have a little bit less than 4 minutes here, and I want to get 2 more questions in. So the first one goes to Shannon, and it says, how do our adversaries' ethics impact how we will fight in the future? And I think that question is important, because often when our adversaries don't share our same ethics, we assume that they have no ethics, when in fact they do. So again, how will our adversaries' ethics impact how we fight? And then to close it out, to Heather, with AI, can we explain the unexplainable? So we'll start with Shannon.
Well, I'll be brief in that we only have 3 minutes left, and I want Heather to be able to answer hers. But I will just say that once again, I think it's important that we don't hand our ethics over to our opponents in any sense. So it's essential that we, first of all, are completely clear on what we stand for and where the lines are for ourselves, and make sure that we hold those steady. But I do think when we look at the future and how others may use technology, it's perhaps a good idea to recognize that anything we build will leak to our opponents eventually. So even as we're thinking through these design points that we've tried to highlight in both of our points today, we also need to think in terms of, and what if this gets in the hands of people who have bad intentions and who have, malicious actors who have harm on their minds? What can they do to twist it? So something that may seem even innocent or innocuous could be a tremendous threat in the future if we're not creative thinkers and we're not imagining how could this new technology be turned against us. We need to think about that, recognize our own vulnerabilities, and guard against them, but not by throwing out our ethics.
Great. Yes. Heather, final thoughts.
Yeah, so really quickly, no, AI cannot explain the unexplainable. It's just because we have to create the systems, we have to provide it with the data, we have to, AIs might be able to find interesting and novel patterns in things that we hadn't noticed before. But in terms of some sort of super intelligence or artificial general intelligence, that's going to be some oracle, giving us advice from on high. I just think that that's not a thing. So just be, if it were me and someone said, hey, look at this really cool widget, don't you want it? I would just start hoping that our armed forces are going to start asking some basic questions, a healthy dose of skepticism that people who design these systems are not all smart, even though they might be very intelligent, they might not be street smart. So, just thinking through, be a cautious skeptic. A cautious optimist. How about that? A cautious optimist going forward. Thanks.
Great. Well, ladies, I'd really like to thank you for your time today. To the audience, I apologize for all the screaming and yelling between our two panelists here today. I hope that there'll be less arguments in the future between the two of them. But no, in all seriousness, this was a great panel. And I'd like to thank Dr. Shannon French and Dr. Heather Roff. This is Dr. Mark Grzegorzewski, and I'd like to turn it back over to the studio. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Mark, Heather, and Shannon. What a great panel that not only focused on ethics in the operating environment, the challenges, but also cautioned us against over-reliance on technology. It's a fantastic session. This brings our session on ethics in the compound security environment to a close. Thanks again to our panelists for their comments and perspectives.